All right, so get this. What if we could use virtual reality, like literally walk a mile in someone else's shoes, to actually become more empathetic, especially about things like racial bias? And that's exactly what a 2021 research article from the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology looked into, so we are doing a deep dive into their findings today. Now, before we get into their results, though, let's make sure we understand what they actually did.
Yeah, so essentially they were comparing two ways of trying to get people to, like, step into someone else's shoes.
I'm intrigued.
The first one uses VR, and they call this one embodied perspective taking. And it's about creating a really immersive experience where you really feel like you are seeing the world through someone else's eyes.
Whoa, like a total body swap, huh? I can only imagine how strange that must feel.
Yeah, and that's what's so cool about it. Like, it's one thing to imagine it, but then to actually feel it. They wanted to see if that really visceral sensory experience, if it had a different impact than other more traditional methods.
Which brings us to the second approach, right? Which they called mental perspective taking. And this one's a little more familiar, I think, because it's kind of like what we do when we get really into a good book.
Exactly. It's more about using your imagination,
Yeah.
and using that to consciously step into someone else's mindset.
So, two paths to understanding. One's super high-tech and the other's more, I don't know, old school. But did either of them actually work?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, well, it's kind of complicated. On the one hand, they found that the VR experience, it did seem to actually increase certain types of empathy.
Okay, you can't just leave me hanging like that. Tell me more about these empathy findings.
Sure, so they look at a few types of empathy, but one they were particularly interested in was this thing called empathic concern. Basically, it's that feeling of genuine care and concern you get when you see someone who's, like, struggling. You know that feeling when it just makes you want to reach out and help?
Yeah, totally.
So they found that the people who did the body swap thing in VR, they actually showed way higher levels of empathic concern compared to the other groups.
So instead of just imagining walking in someone else's shoes, they were actually feeling it, and that made them care more. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. But why, though? Like, what's going on in our brains when we experience something like that?
Well, it's like, how our brains are wired to, like, connect with other people. Sometimes it just takes something to help us see past our own limited view. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it seems like VR might be that thing to give us that extra push. Because when you're seeing the world through someone else's eyes, like literally seeing it, feeling their movements, your brain sort of starts to blur the lines.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's like this merging of selves in a way. And that's what can create that really powerful feeling of connection, that empathy.
Okay, so we're not just talking about imagining anymore. We're talking about really feeling it physically, emotionally even. So this makes me wonder, if VR can be that powerful, if it can actually change how empathetic we feel, could it also change, like, our deeply held beliefs? Like, what about implicit bias, those associations we make without even realizing it?
Yeah, and that is, like, the big question, right? That's what the researchers really wanted to figure out. And to be honest, this is where the results, they get a little tricky.
Oh, really? See, I have to admit, when I first read this study, I was like so excited at the whole VR thing. Like maybe we found this empathy boosting miracle. But then I got to the part about implicit bias and, well, it wasn't exactly what I was hoping for.
Yeah, so they used a test. It's called the implicit association test. And it's meant to measure those super quick unconscious reactions we have that show our biases. And the thing is, neither the people who tried the VR nor the ones who did the mental perspective taking thing, they didn't actually have any big changes in their scores on that test.
Wow, so even though the VR seemed to make them more empathetic, it didn't actually get rid of those deeper biases. That's so interesting. What do you think is going on there? Is VR just not the magic answer we thought it was?
Well, I don't think it's that simple. We have to remember that these biases, these thought patterns, they're ingrained,
Yeah.
They're formed from years of experiences, societal stuff, all of that. So thinking that one short VR session, even if it's really intense, could erase all that, well, it's probably not realistic.
I see. So it's more complicated than that. Like you wouldn't expect to just, I don't know, run a marathon after just one day at the gym, right?
Exactly. Plus, there are other things to consider, too. Like in this study, the participants, they already had pretty low levels of implicit bias to begin with. So it's possible that VR would have a bigger impact on people who have, more room for improvement, so to speak.
So maybe it's more about, like, I don't know, giving people a nudge in the right direction than completely changing who they are. But here's another thing I was thinking about. Even if we could somehow erase those those unconscious biases with VR. What about the beliefs people, like, consciously hold? Their actual opinions about different racial groups? That's going to be way harder to change, right? Like a 5-minute VR experience can't do that, can it?
You're right. Changing those conscious beliefs, those attitudes, it's a whole different challenge. And yeah, in this study, they found that neither the VR nor the perspective taking really changed those explicit racial attitudes.
Yeah, it makes sense though, right? Those beliefs just feel so much more like ingrained, almost like they're a bigger part of who we are than those implicit biases. Did the researchers talk about why those beliefs might be harder to change?
They did, yeah. One thing they pointed out was just the time thing. Those interventions were so short, just a few minutes. And to really change something as fundamental as your beliefs about, whole groups of people, well, it's probably going to take more than that. It's like anything else you're trying to learn or unlearn. It takes time and effort.
It's like you can't expect to be fluent in a new language just from listening to a couple sentences, right? It's about constantly being around it, trying, making mistakes even.
Exactly. And especially with something as sensitive and complex as racial bias, you have to be in it for the long haul. This study, it's really just a starting point, like a small glimpse into what VR might be able to do to create empathy and understanding.
Okay, so where do we go from here? If 5 minutes in VR isn't enough to get rid of years of bias, what does that mean for VR? What's next?
Well, I think it opens up some exciting possibilities. Like, what if instead of a few minutes, we had these super immersive VR experiences that lasted way longer and people could really interact with each other, like have real conversations? Or what if we combine VR with actual real-world interactions? There's so many options to explore.
It's almost like we've been handed this amazing tool, but we haven't quite figured out how to use it to its full potential yet. There's just so much we could do.
That's what I find so exciting about it. It's still early days. We have the chance to really shape how VR is used to make sure it's a force for good in the world.
So the takeaway is maybe VR isn't a quick fix for bias, but it could be this really powerful way to help us be more empathetic and understanding, and that's huge. Who knows what the future holds, right? Maybe one day, walking a mile in someone else's shoes in VR, it'll be as normal as reading a book or watching a movie. And maybe, just maybe, it can help us create a world where everyone feels seen and understood.